Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSF 401, Political Behavior. This week, we are back to our regularly scheduled programming. Tomorrow and the next day, I will be grading all of the remaining items, so keep an eye out on Canvas for all of the grades for that. I apologize for the delay. As I mentioned in the announcement, I was traveling to a conference last week, so I'm a bit behind, but hopefully by this Wednesday, I will be all caught up. Today, we'll be discussing vote choice, with specific attention being given to presidential vote choice. But first, we need to discuss the models that have been described across these past 2 weeks. And specifically, there are 4 models that warrant some discussion here. These, taken collectively, provide a pretty good accounting of political science's current understanding of vote choice and the determinants thereof. First, let's talk about Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, taken from the American Voter, specifically here, Chapter 19. In line with their other arguments about politics, they argue that vote choice is the result of specifically attitudes that have a directional and magnitude component. We can think about these almost like vectors, and the attitudes themselves are on the basis of evaluative objects or items that they are evaluating. These can be individual candidates, these can be parties, these can be policy items, these can even be current events. It depends on the specifics here. CCMS fundamentally argue, though, that partisanship itself affects and is affected by these attitudes or these orientations towards these specific political or evaluative objects here. And they argue that individual voters will cast their vote for the candidates that the candidates for whom their attitudes are the most positive, both direction and magnitude again here. That's a lot of words. Let's look at a specific quote here starting on page 528 that describes their view towards vote choice. Quoting, "When the individual acts towards the world of politics, as he does in casting a vote, his behavior is guided immediately by evaluations of the things that he sees in that world." Fundamentally, what they're arguing here is that vote choice is a reflection of attitudes, and attitudes are the result of innumerable non-political and political factors. Things like age, marital status, job, social network, social group, and considerations of identity can all have an effect on an individual's attitudes towards one of these or many evaluative objects. Returning to the quote, "By measuring these evaluations, we are able to account for the individual's partisan choice, and by summing their effects across the electorate, we are able to resolve an electoral decision into its attitudinal components." End of the quote there. What they're arguing here is that partisans themselves, people who are Democrats, people who are Republicans, have shared evaluation structures. And we can identify what the attitudes and evaluative objects are and which ones were important to the voters. Fundamentally, partisans behave in similar manners. And on the basis of those behaviors, we can kind of extrapolate the clusters of partisan behavior, and then within those clusters, determine what attitudes, what evaluative objects were important to those voters specifically. Returning again to the quote, "Yet evaluations of politics are not formed wholly anew in each presidential campaign. Some evaluations persist through time, and so do certain dispositions to evaluate the elements of politics in a given partisan way." Fundamentally here, attitudes are sticky. Individuals don't wildly fluctuate from one election to the next in their view of a party or the view of a policy or a candidate, whatever it might be. Instead, attitudinal change of this type requires very big events, crises, instances of corruption, for example, in order to motivate meaningful change. The authors here talk about realignments, drawing from V.O. Keyes' discussion of the same. And basically here, people will behave similarly from one election to the next if they are not given a significant reason not to. Finally, and closing out with a quote here, "Most Americans have an enduring partisan orientation, a sense of party identification, which has wide effects on their attitudes towards the things that are visible in the political world." fundamentally, the attitudes on which the vote choice decision is made are not entirely rational, especially towards the parties themselves. Partisanship, returning to earlier in Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes's The American Voter, partisanship is the perceptual screen through which individuals view the political world. And fundamentally, this perceptual lens conditions the way in which they view the world. It conditions the way that evaluations, that attitudes are considered. Therefore, vote choice is largely the result, at least in this author's or these authors' view, is largely the result of partisan attachment, not a sober evaluation of the different policy items. So that's Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, sometimes called the Michigan view, given where they worked, sometimes called the attitudinal view on the basis of what they focus on. Kind of the inverse of this view is posited by Downs. Downs is the seminal text here. We can consider this as a more rational choice view of the vote choice decision here. And fundamentally, Downs takes an almost economics view of vote choice, arguing that vote choice is basically a rational choice. People rationally, or voters rationally weigh the benefits for given candidates being elected compared to one another. And individuals will vote for the candidate that provides them the greatest benefit. All voting decisions are subject to a cost, be this informational, be this time, be this a loss of wages, whatever it might be. And so the decision on which candidate to vote for is largely the result, in this view, of an economic rational choice calculation on the basis of policy, on the basis of tax rates, for example. Which candidate will provide the individual voter a greater utility, and therefore that voter will cast their ballot on that basis. Now, this kind of rational choice view of politics has undergone a number of iterations over the preceding decades, or intervening decades, I should say. One element to give specific attention to here is the P term in this calculation. That's the probability of an individual casting the decisive ballot. That was counterbalanced, or let's say further expanded, with Riker and Ordershuk in 1968, Hanelo and Inich in 1984 offered a further expansion of it. This kind of rational choice view has undergone many iterations in the intervening decades, but this is the fundamental intuition here. Now, this view requires something of an assumption here. This is the idea that voters have a shared view of policy or otherwise ideological space upon which they are making a decision for whom to vote for. This is quite an assumption, and something we'll return to at the end of today's lecture here. Next up here are Healy and Malhotra. This is an argument that vote choice is not naive to past performances. Fundamentally, voters are not entering the ballot box in a given election and discarding all of the previous information they have about politics upon entry. Instead, they perform what are called retrospective evaluations of candidates and parties, specifically looking at past performance and casting their votes on that basis. If, when looking back at politics, a particular party has failed to live up to their campaign promises, or has done exceptionally poorly on economic concerns, or law and order concerns, or immigration concerns, or education concerns, then they are going to necessarily discount the current promises made in that campaign, either by the party or by the individual candidates themselves. Most significant here are economic retrospective evaluations. Which party, which candidate has consistently delivered better economic conditions? And on the basis of that retrospective view, individuals will cast their ballots for the candidates that they believe is best suited to deliver the best form of governance in the subsequent governance cycle. There's also a view of prospective evaluations. It's kind of a separate literature here, but it's very much the flip side, where we don't read that in this class. I didn't assign that, but that is a literature as well. Finally here, Bartels, 1996, the reading from this week, in addition to the textbook, argues kind of pushing back against the view that was popular at the time, that even if people do not have a very clear view of ideology, they don't have clear ideological preferences, they don't have complete information about all of the different policy priorities and campaign promises, that they can behave as if rationally and make a good enough decision at the ballot box here. The kind of Fiorina or Conover and Feldman, which we've read previously, use of heuristics or informational shortcuts to make a good enough decision at the ballot box, or an as if rational decision. Also pushing back on the view that taken collectively, the electorate makes the correct decision or the right decision, despite having not perfect information here or other individual failings. As well as pushing back on the idea that endorsements can be basically a supplement for this perfect information here. Bartels, through an experimental study, shows a disconnect between voting behavior when voters have perfect information and voting behavior when voters have the commonly held information that they have, that everyday voters have, when they go to the ballot box. They behave differently. And this is pointed out as kind of a flaw in our current understanding of democratic politics. People are not casting their ballots entirely rationally. They are not casting their ballots on which candidate or which party is going to deliver the most desired form of governance on the basis of policy. This can be considered that individuals or voters vote incorrectly in most elections under most circumstances here. And there's some discussion of calling into question the kind of aspirational notion of our current form of democratic governance as a result of this. This is, argument, kind of subtext within here, is that vote choice necessarily is therefore the result largely of some degree of biases and kind of non-rational considerations on the part of the voter here. And this really does raise the question, along with the other models of vote choice, of the question, what is the correct vote for any individual voter, right? Should we just evaluate this on the basis of economic evaluations, economic considerations? Should we take the Downsian approach and say, okay, let's evaluate this rationally from an economics point of view? Which candidate, which party is going to deliver materially better or materially greater conditions to the voter if they were to be elected and if they were to deliver on all of their campaign promises? One of my favorite books, actually, in the past few decades here, is called "What's the Matter with Kansas" by Frank. A picture of the book is on screen now. This book discusses how, basically, for Kansas voters, for the vast majority of voters in Kansas, if they voted for the Democratic Party, they would actually see a material economic benefit to their vote compared to their observed voting behavior, which is largely Republican in nature. Basically here, this book tries to answer the question of why the economic interests are not the decisive factor in or for Kansas voters here. Fundamentally, the book argues that Kansas voters are not really voting on the basis of economic interest. Instead, they're voting on the basis of more symbolic politics, more issue-oriented politics, and more personality-based, candidate-centric approaches. It's really not appropriate to say that these voters are voting incorrectly in any meaningful way. Voters in this context, in Kansas and elsewhere, vote on the criteria, vote on the basis that makes the most sense to them. And it's really inappropriate for political scientists to call this incorrect. Despite what the implications of Bartels and others are, no one's really arguing that they're incorrect. We're just fundamentally trying to understand the vote choice decision criteria here. Now, when we're talking about presidential elections in particular, these are the most high information elections in American politics. If voters were ever going to vote correctly within this context, it would be in presidential elections. But as we'll see in congressional elections next week and local elections, even beyond that, people tend to vote in those elections on even more parochial, even more kind of personalized politics basis, and in many cases solely on the basis of partisan identification. And so fundamentally here, I want to emphasize that none of these criteria are wrong. People vote on what is important to them, and that's okay. But it's incumbent on political scientists to understand the criteria along which these vote decisions are made. What's very clear here is that it's entirely likely that all of these models of vote choice that are posited that we've discussed today are very likely true to some voters at certain times. It depends on the context. It depends on the voter. There are likely some voters that election to election try and make a rational calculation on which candidate is going to deliver a better material or economic benefit to them. There are other voters that are casting their ballot either solely on partisanship or on whichever candidate they feel they are closest to. This isn't like an objective evaluation. It's just very much vibes, very much feels. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we, as political scientists, need to determine when that is occurring and when that is most likely to affect observed outcomes here. Flipping to kind of candidate side of this, they can't perfectly model their campaign style because different voters are reaching the voting decision differently. And therefore, candidates have to kind of blend the rational choice, economic, policy-oriented style of politics with a much more personal, with a much more attitudinal, with a much more, let's call it, vibe style approach. Candidates that focus exclusively on policy and completely ignore the kind of attitudinal aspects of politics are not going to be successful, especially at the presidential level. We can look at Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign for an example of this. This was a campaign that relied very heavily on specific policy promises, and he lost in a landslide. The kind of charismatic, very personalized politics, that also doesn't work without at least some degree of attention to policy items, as not all voters are just going to make that determination based on attitudes here. As political scientists, we do the best that we can to understand these criteria, understand the different vote decision processes that are being made. But generally speaking, it's going to vary from election to election, from candidate to candidate, and specifically from voter to voter here. So that's really all I have for you today. Be sure to understand the different vote choice models that we've discussed both this week and previous week. Next week, as I say, we'll be looking at vote choice or vote decisions in congressional elections. So a little bit different and largely due to that lower information that I described previously. This week, we again have peer reviews due this Friday, and your final response paper for the semester is due this Sunday. I want to briefly discuss the response paper prompt, just to kind of orient your thinking about this. The prompt reads, in the textbook, the section entitled Putting It All Together, Predicting Vote Choice, starting on page 280, offers several models of explaining presidential vote choice. Bartels, 1996, demonstrates that the American electorate is not as well informed about key political issues as we might desire. How does this observation by Bartels affect the interpretation of Thies-Morson-Wagner's Model 2? What is Thies-Morson-Wagner's view? Have conditions changed in the United States since Bartels conducted his analysis that might undermine his findings? If so, why and how? I framed this very much in putting a tension between Thies-Morson-Wagner, the textbook, and Bartels, the required reading, that article. But I also want you to draw in the models of vote choice that were covered last week as well here. what is the best approach? Under what conditions would we want to adopt one vote choice model versus another? And how have modern developments changed this? Are we more well informed now than we were 20 years ago? I guess now 30 years ago in 1996, 2026. But give this some meaningful degree of consideration and don't feel constrained to just compare and contrast the textbook as well as Bartel's. Feel free to draw in the American Voter, Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, Downs, as well as some of the other vote choice models that we've discussed this semester. So that's all I have for you this week. I want you to enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy the sunshine. It's getting a little bit warmer out there, so be sure to enjoy it. And as always, feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns that you may have.